interiors and exteriors. Throughout the ages, creative practitioners from a wide range of backgrounds have attributed their productivity to some external force, or at least attested to feeling some bafflement as to their own contribution to the work they have made. The renunciation of self as part of authorship is familiar to Maurice Blanchot, who claims that a writer is fated to sacrifice himself for the work, become other, that he must become no one, the empty and animated space where the call of the work resounds. And here we are also reminded of Gilles Deleuze's virtual object, an entity that lacks its own identity precisely so as to have the capacity to accommodate an alternate quality. Speaking in the 1970s, an African carver offers a particularly compelling testimony about the mask he has made. Once again, this comes from this anthropological book by Alfred Gell, and the carver says, "I see the thing I have made. To me, it is like what I see when I'm dreaming. I say to myself, this is what my familiar spirit has brought to my mind. I say, I have made this. How can a man make such a thing? It is a fearful thing that I can do." In guises more or less intuitive to our modern sensibilities, the idea of the author as a medium dates back at least to antiquity. Where the ancient Greeks attributed artistic craft to channeling the divine voices of the muses, the evangelists reported that their hand had been guided by the Holy Ghost in writing the Gospels. Coinciding with the birth of experimental psychology, it is possible to trace a resurgence of this emphasis on inspiration, being breathed into, is what inspiration means from Latin. You can see this emphasis on inspiration resurging in the 19th century Romanticism, only in this case, the divine, gods and muses, the divine is replaced by the unbridled forces of the unconscious. And this is a point, I think, by Sean Burke in his edited volume on authorship. So, as in the examples that we talked about, right, from Cézanne to T.S. Eliot, the same idea surfaces in modernism, taking on a register that is at once scientific and spiritual. This preoccupation with the artist as medium persists in contemporary artists' conceptualizations of their own creativity, as can be seen among many others in Cindy Sherman, as we spoke about, Orhan Pamuk's poet Ka, and the sculptor Heidi Lau. So I think there's a little quotation from one of Orhan Pamuk's works. So reading the footnote there, the quotation is, "A careful reading reveals that Ka did not believe himself to be the true author of any of the poems that came to him in Kars. Rather, he believed himself to be but a medium." And then going to the sculptor Heidi Lau, and this is taken from an interview, Lau says, "It really feels like I am the medium. Something passes through me or my hands directed by the clay. Instead of me sculpting it, it's like it's sculpting me back." A common intuition emerging from these examples is that artists must empty themselves in order to become receptive as mediums. In Plato's Ion, Socrates claims that a great poet works at their best when they are out of their senses or beside themselves, because that is the state in which they are most amenable to being possessed by external forces so as to be used as ministers of the whims of some third party, like the muses. Imagine then an ancient poet getting ready to compose a verse. They step outside of their own body and wait beside themselves, whilst a ghostly voice enters their vacated corporeal cavity and instrumentalizes it for purposes unknown. After all, a muse, god, subconscious desire, brooding landscape, familiar spirit, or any ghostly agent for that matter, surely cannot enter a body that is already occupied with a lucid soul. It must be vacated first. Throughout history, the voice that speaks through the medium of the artist has been attributed to different sources. However, in each case, there is a sense that something came and went through and by means of the artist as its minister, and that somewhere within the person of the artist, there was a space which was full and then emptied. The assumption that adequate space first needs to be made before this other can enter, inhabit, or possess the medium of the artist reveals a certain fixation on the spatiality of selfhood, complete with coordinates, positions, and distance. This is also reflected in prepositions used. T.S. Eliot suggests that tradition recombines itself inside the poet's mind, just as Cézanne invites the landscape to think itself in him. Further, we might ask, what is the artist mediating between? Where does this ghostly agency come from? How does it pass through the artist? What is it that comes out? So all these prepositions are pointing to a kind of spatial idea of selfhood. There is a certain mechanical pragmatism to this language, which renders its subjects roomy and viscous. Things take time to pass through the artist and must labor to get out. The artist is a thing that is here in relation to its potential possessor, like a muse, which comes from some indiscernible vanishing point over there. Here we recall the presumed vectors within subject, object, or active-passive relations in grammar, and the agential directionality they imply. Again, what I said earlier, Katarina is drinking the coffee, so there's a sort of vector pointing from me to the coffee in a way that is how we imagine agency flowing in a certain direction. The use of these prepositions in discussing agency reflects a spatial conception of self, which models it as a function receiving inputs and returning outputs. So if I'm an agent, we kind of imagine an agent to be something that takes in inputs and spits out outputs, a machine for being. This seems to reveal an underlying assumption of a physics of agency or a mechanics of self, complete with laws of motion, conservation of spiritual matter, and an exclusion principle. And these phrases I'm uttering here, by the way, are from the language of physics. In a way, we could apply them to our burgeoning idea here of the mechanics of self. Selfhood and agency, we also seem to have an exclusion principle for it, and that is the intuition that two agents cannot occupy the same soul space simultaneously, that one or the other takes over. So in physics, if I have a cup of coffee here, the exclusion principle states that there cannot be something else occupying the same space that this cup is occupying. The fact that the cup is here in these coordinates of space means that nothing else can be there. Matter takes up space and nothing can be simultaneously occupying the same space as that bit of matter. And so that's kind of how we're intuiting agency as well, that if we conceive of my body as the kind of field in which agency is taking place, the same soul space cannot be simultaneously occupied by two different souls. One or the other takes over. Spatial conceptualizations of self and how they govern our expectations about the mechanics of self will be discussed in Chapter 2. But for now, we can ask, what are the qualities of a good medium? Following Cézanne's iterative brushstrokes, a good medium must be made of some uniform cellular volume, like the atoms of sounding air. For T.S. Eliot, A good medium makes no personal impositions, which are only noise to the self-othering the poet seeks. One must lie still like a guitar string to become animated with character. So a guitar string waits lying still, impersonal, is not imposing a sound, so that a sound can be imposed on its body. It can become animated with a kind of character, a note. With Cindy Sherman, we saw how her mediation of diverse fictional characters affects also the flavour of her own selfhood, at least as it is perceived by her audience. As with the spiritual medium, she is possessed by others, and her entire identity, for us, her audience, seems characterized by her anonymous ubiquity. With T.S. Eliot, we might then wonder whether subscribing to this view of authorship as mediation in turn suggests the broader notion that a person in itself is a kind of medium, whose essence, if we had to ascribe it something such, would be an essence of potential.